In the winter of 1944, when snow blanketed the Ardennes like an unrelenting shroud and the German advance seemed unstoppable, even the most seasoned Allied commanders felt the shadow of uncertainty. The battle had erupted with unexpected ferocity, opening a gap in the front that no one had foreseen. Information arrived in fragments, radio messages were unreliable, and confusion reigned thicker than the icy mist that enveloped the forests. At the Allied headquarters in Versailles, every corridor was filled with a tense silence. Men hurried along, folders in hand, unable to tell whether what they carried was good or bad news. Every passing hour meant another piece of territory lost. Amid this anxiety, Bastogne leapt into everyone's attention. The small Belgian town, insignificant on any map, had become the focal point of the German offensive, a strategic position that had to be held at all costs, due to the roads and intersections that made it crucial. The 101st Airborne Division, isolated and without proper winter clothing, with dwindling ammunition and nearly exhausted medical supplies, had been holding out for days. They did not ask for mercy, only for help. They knew they could resist, but not indefinitely. For General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, the pressure was relentless. No document, no meeting, could shake the persistent thought that haunted him: if Bastogne fell, the German breach would widen, and the entire Allied defensive line would risk collapse. Yet Eisenhower did not allow himself to panic. His staff could sense it: quick movements, low voices, repeated checks of the numbers. In that tense atmosphere, shortly after 9 a.m., a courier entered the main room. His breath steamed in the freezing air, and his boots left traces of melting snow. He held a sheet just delivered from the communications center, which went straight into Eisenhower's hands. He skimmed the message quickly, then reread it slowly. When he lifted his gaze, no words were needed. Those around him understood immediately. A slight tension vanished, replaced by a spark of relief and triumph. The sheet said only one thing: Patton's Third Army had reached the gates of Bastogne. They had beaten the Germans. For 3 days, headquarters had watched Patton's audacious maneuver in disbelief, moving an entire army through a winter storm, with tanks, artillery, and supply lines. When Eisenhower had asked how long the operation would take, Patton had assured him he could strike within 48 hours. Many had doubted. Now the answer was clear. Eisenhower inhaled slowly, not with full relief, but with something that resembled it. His staff watched him, tense and expectant. Some anticipated a theatrical reaction, a shout of victory; others, a triumphant gesture on the table. But he set the sheet down carefully and spoke in a calm, steady voice. "Gentlemen, Patton made it." Those words, simple and direct, carried an immense weight. The atmosphere in the room changed in an instant. The tension did not vanish, but it lightened, leaving room for cautious hope. One of the intelligence officers murmured softly, "It's true, he really did it." Eisenhower pointed to the message. "This changes everything," he said. "The Germans were counting on cutting our lines and taking Bastogne. Patton beat them to it. Their plan is broken. And when a plan like that collapses, an offensive loses momentum." No dramatic words or grand gestures were needed. His authority lay in clarity and decisiveness. Yet everyone felt the significance of what he said. The German assault, fierce and devastating, now had a crack. Patton, with his boldness and controversies, had seized the decisive moment. Then Eisenhower turned his gaze to the map. "We are not celebrating," he continued firmly. "Bastogne is still under pressure. The 101st remains surrounded. Patton's units have reached the line, but the corridor must hold. We need to widen it. This is not the finish line, it's the start of a turning point." He paused, letting the words sink in. The staff nodded, aware that the work was far from over. Outside, the snow muffled every sound of the world beyond. Inside, however, something had changed. A sense of purpose replaced the previous anxiety. Officers moved with renewed determination. Radio operators adjusted their equipment. Liaison teams prepared to inform British and American commands. The desperate defense of Bastogne was slowly transforming into an organized counterattack. An intelligence officer later recalled that, in the minutes following the arrival of the message, the room seemed to breathe again. It was not naive optimism, but vitality. And vitality meant momentum. Momentum meant that the Allies were no longer merely reacting, they were regaining the initiative. Eisenhower lifted the sheet once more. Patton was the first to reach Bastogne, he repeated quietly. Let's make sure this effort was not in vain. The staff dispersed, each returning to their task, but the energy in the room had changed. The news spread like an electric spark, igniting even the rooms where smiles were rare. For the first time since the start of the German offensive, the Allies felt that the enemy's advance was no longer inevitable. At the heart of this change was a simple truth: Patton had kept his promise. As the officers dispersed to relay orders and updates, Eisenhower remained still before the large map. The thick lines marking the advance of the German armored divisions toward Bastogne seemed almost to pulse under the lamplight. The message that had just arrived was good news, certainly, but not the kind that granted respite. If anything, it was the prelude to an even harsher phase. The Germans, thrown off balance by Patton's arrival, would not surrender the crossroads they had fought for so fiercely. It was clear they would unleash a brutal counterattack. And Patton, after marching through ice, ambushes, and impassable roads, now had to defend a corridor as fragile as glass. For just a moment, Eisenhower closed his eyes and ran a hand across his forehead. The weight of command was immense. Hundreds of thousands of men were fighting on a burning continent, and yet the responsibility for coordinating everything fell on a small number of people. On him, more than anyone. He had to decide without hesitation, even when the information was incomplete, contradictory, or barely sketched out. But the news of Patton's advance had brought new vigor to headquarters. Now it was up to Eisenhower to turn that energy into something concrete and lasting. He moved into the main office, where several officers were already updating their reports. He spoke with a clear, firm voice. Establish direct contact with Middleton's command immediately. Inform them that Patton has opened a passage and that reinforcements will move through it. I want precise confirmations of unit positions. The officers set to work without hesitation. The confidence slowly returning to the room was turning into operational discipline. Eisenhower added, Inform London as well. They need to know the situation is beginning to stabilize. Behind the general's composure lay a hint of satisfaction. The Germans had based their plan on surprise, on Allied disorganization, and on the bad weather that grounded the Air Force. But they had made a mistake. They had underestimated the endurance of the American divisions and, above all, Patton's speed. For days, some officers had voiced skepticism. Was it really possible to move an entire army through that chaos? To cross mile after mile of hostile territory in the dead of winter? For many, Patton was more reckless than prudent. Eisenhower, however, understood that recklessness. It wasn't madness, it was strategy. When others slowed down, Patton accelerated. When others sought safety, he found opportunity. And now that aggressiveness was giving the Allies what they needed most: the initiative. In the communications room, the first reports began crackling over the loudspeakers. Armored column of the Third Army entering the Bastogne area. Link up with airborne units expected shortly. Enemy resistance significant but decreasing. Every word seemed to confirm that the breach was real and holding. Eisenhower returned to his senior planners. Gentlemen, he said, this is our chance to turn the offensive around. But we must act with absolute precision. The Germans are stretched thin. If we strike where it hurts most, their momentum will fracture. He pointed to the map, tracing the contour of the German bulge. Their advance narrows here. If we attack from the north and south at the same time, the salient will collapse. Major General Walter Bedell Smith stepped forward. Patton has bought us time, but the Germans will concentrate their forces against the corridor. I'm aware of that, Eisenhower replied. And that's precisely why we must press them on the flanks. They can't defend everything. And if we hold Bastogne, their plan jams. Eisenhower was not merely giving orders. He was reasserting control over a battlefield that seemed to be slipping from his grasp. His confidence spread quickly, passing from planners to staff officers, to intelligence teams, all those who, in the previous days, had felt the weight of chaos on their shoulders. Hundreds of kilometers away, the news reached the troops trapped in the snow. The word spread from trench to trench. "Patton is coming!" Like a warm wind threading through frozen trees, the phrase brought hope and movement, suggesting that the encirclement might finally break. At headquarters, Eisenhower approached a group of intelligence officers analyzing German forces. "What do we know about the reserves?" he asked. One officer quickly scanned through the folders. "Panzer Lehr is worn down but still operational. The 2nd Panzer Division is exhausted." Another added, "The weather is improving, sir. Our air forces could be back in action soon." Eisenhower nodded, aware of the importance of clear skies. As soon as Allied aircraft returned to the fight, German supply lines would become vulnerable, and the Luftwaffe would no longer hold control. Its strength had been eroded over recent months. The next clearing of clouds would give the Allies the chance to strike hard. He turned to his staff. "As soon as conditions allow, I want maximum air support concentrated on their supply lines. They are already overstretched. A targeted bombing could break their momentum." Then Eisenhower refocused on the heart of the battle. "Patton's success is our opportunity," he said. "But the men in Bastogne are still fighting for their lives. Their courage has bought us time, and we must repay it." These were not empty words. Everyone knew what the 101st Airborne Division had endured: relentless bombardment, biting cold, and supplies reduced to nearly nothing. They had held out without yielding. Their determination had become symbolic, not just for the Allies, but for the entire world. As morning slipped into afternoon, reports confirmed that the corridor was holding. Patton's infantry and tanks steadily advanced toward the center of the town. Some German units were retreating, others trying to reorganize, but the momentum had shifted. Eisenhower convened his staff one last time for the day. "This is the decisive moment," he said. "We hold the corridor, widen it, and then push the enemy back beyond the line we've reached." In his eyes, beyond the fatigue accumulated over the previous days, shone something rare: confidence. The Battle of the Ardennes was far from over. Snow continued to fall, and fighting raged among forests and villages. But the tone had changed. Fear had given way to determination, doubt was replaced by direction. At the center of it all was Eisenhower's silent but clear message, spreading among the men like a steady hand on a trembling shoulder. "Patton was the first to arrive. Now let's finish what he started." Evening slowly fell over the Versailles headquarters, but inside the command rooms, the pace was increasing. Reports from the Third Army came without pause, painting an ever clearer picture of Bastogne. The corridor opened by Patton was narrow, dangerous, and constantly threatened by enemy counterattacks, but it existed. And that alone represented a strategic miracle. The soldiers of the 101st, now nicknamed the Battered Bastards of Bastogne, were no longer alone. Reinforcements had arrived. As Eisenhower walked through the rooms of headquarters, his pace slow but deliberate, he stopped before a tall, narrow window. The French night was motionless, wrapped in a silence that felt unreal. Out there everything seemed calm, a stark contrast to the brutal reality unfolding in the Ardennes. He rested his hand on the cold windowsill, letting a single moment of quiet remind him of the weight of the week that had just passed. The German offensive had strained every certainty, forcing commanders and troops alike to react with almost desperate speed. Now, however, something had changed. The speed of the Third Army and the audacity of its commander had flipped the perspective. Where there had only been urgency, now a possibility could be seen. Measured footsteps approached behind him. It was Bedell Smith, always present, reliable, observant. "Sir, new reports from the 101st," he announced. "They've linked up with elements of the 4th Armored Division. Morale is rising significantly." Eisenhower turned slightly, his expression grave but touched by a hint of relief. "Excellent," he said. "Those men have endured more than anyone could have asked." Smith nodded briefly. It seems McAuliffe has sent a message to the Third Army. A remark about Christmas arriving early. A faint smile crossed Eisenhower's face. They've earned it, he murmured. He returned to the large planning table. The map of the Ardennes, worn from days of relentless briefings, was covered with fresh marks, arrows, circles, notes, scribbled along the margins. Eisenhower laid his hands on the edges, as if trying to anchor the chaos on paper before moving forward. We need to look beyond Bastogne, he declared. Patton's breakthrough isn't the conclusion. It's the lever that allows us to overturn the entire offensive. Smith leaned over the map. Analysis shows the Germans are low on fuel. Their armored drive is inevitably losing momentum. Then we strike now, Eisenhower replied without hesitation. When an advance stops, it begins to crumble. Their whole operation relied on surprise. Without surprise, the structure collapses. The certainty in his voice settled over the room like solid weight. No theatrics, just understanding. Eisenhower knew the cruel rhythm of war, how quickly a victory could shift, how fragile the balance of momentum was. He called in his senior officers. They entered carrying files, updates, hastily drawn sketches of division movements. Eisenhower remained standing, projecting a firm control no one dared question. Gentlemen, he began, the Germans have staked everything on this initiative. Their lines are stretched to the limit, their supplies thinning, their reserves insufficient. Now we must strike hard. We hold Bastogne, widen the breach, and then turn their own salient against them. One of the officers, pencil in hand, raised a concern. Sir, the weather remains unstable. Air support is not guaranteed. Eisenhower looked at him with steady calm. When the sky opens, we act. Until then, our ground forces will hold. Patton is already advancing. Montgomery will move in from the north as soon as the situation allows. Let's apply pressure from every side. An officer looked up, hesitant. And German morale? Eisenhower replied without hesitation. It's fragile. They weren't expecting such a rapid response. And certainly not that Patton could move an entire army in just 2 days. Their plan is broken. When a command loses its plan, it loses control. He paused briefly, letting the words settle in the room, then added with a calm that resonated through everyone's focus. This war will still demand everything from us, but today we've shown that the enemy can be surprised. A part of the fear that had accompanied the officers over the previous days dissolved. No shouts or grand gestures were needed, the commander's confidence was enough. Everyone understood that, at least for now, Allied command had regained ground. The meeting broke up, but Eisenhower remained by the map, his eyes tracing the long arc of the German salient, menacing and stretched toward the west. Then he shifted his gaze to the narrow corridor created by Patton, a fragile thread of mud, snow, steel, and will, destined to be the foundation of the counteroffensive. As evening fell, headquarters found a steady rhythm. Officers sent rapid reports, couriers moved from one office to another, and radios crackled with updates from the front. Not all the news was good. The Germans continued trying to cut the corridor. But the tone had changed. No longer despair, but a hard, unyielding determination. Walking through the corridors, Eisenhower noticed how the officers straightened at his passage, not out of formality, but because they had regained confidence. They had seen their commander confront one of the most crucial messages of the war with clarity, not merely relief. In a small briefing room, a young intelligence officer was organizing intercepted German communications. He looked up, surprised to see Eisenhower there. "Sir," he said, "we've confirmed that the German units are confused. Some reports indicate attacks from the east, others from the south. They don't understand how Patton moved so quickly." Eisenhower nodded. "Good. Confusion is a weapon, and right now it's working in our favor." He leaned slightly over the table. "Listen carefully, battles aren't won by chance. They're won because someone refused to surrender." The officer nodded, aware of the weight of those words. Eisenhower left the room, feeling the weight of responsibility mingled with the certainty of the direction taken. He returned to his office, where the original message about Patton's advance lay on the desk, now slightly crumpled. He picked it up, read it one last time, and then set it down carefully. For a moment, he allowed his mind to return to the men at Bastogne, the paratroopers who had held up despite cold, bombardments, and limited supplies. Without their resilience, Patton's speed would have meant nothing. The true strength of the Allied army did not reside in generals or equipment, but in the determination of those who refused to give ground. He straightened and looked around the room. The lamp cast long shadows across the walls, lending an almost somber sense of silence. Yet the documents, maps, and the constant hum of activity beyond the door reminded him that the battle was far from over. Eisenhower returned to the planning table, his fingers slowly tracing the worn edge. He paused, took a deep breath, and spoke aloud, even though the room was empty. "Patton was the first to arrive. Now we must make use of it." It was not a gesture of vanity, even though a sense of pride stirred within him. It was rather a declaration of resolve. The tide had shifted, but the war still demanded vigilance, precise decisions, and total commitment. Outside, the French night remained still, cold, and silent. Inside, however, something had changed. Initiative was no longer in the hands of the enemy. The Allies were no longer merely reacting, they were setting the pace of the battle. Every order, every movement, every decision was now aimed at crushing the German offensive. And it had all begun with a single message, carried through snow and darkness, delivered into Eisenhower's hands, the news that Patton had reached Bastogne before anyone else. That sheet of paper, simple yet crucial, had altered the course of the war. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. See you in the next video.